Thanks, Andrew. So this is for something completely different. Andrew and the organizing committee asked me to talk about fire effects on aquatic ecosystems. And that's a really broad topic, so I've tried to pick and choose some generalities, but as you guys know, maybe different things have happened. And I've tried to use wilderness examples as possible. As Andrew said, I worked on fire effects mostly in the Bitterroot with Mike Jacober. I tried to get him to give this talk, but those of you who are local know he is traveling internationally right now because he retired. But, so you have me. All right, so one of the things that aquatic ecologists have been thinking about is how fires change stream ecosystems, and mostly through the mechanisms of stream habitat characteristics. And so when we think about important stream habitat characteristics for aquatic biota, we think a lot about water temperature, water quality, our chemistry, sediment loads, habitat complexity, and then macroinvertebrates or food webs and fish. We also think about frogs, but I was running out of time. So, all right. And so we know that as we've looked at the effects of fire on stream ecosystems, one of the biggest impacts on stream temperatures, and this is probably an area we know the most about for those of you who work with fish biologists, you know we love to put temperature loggers in streams. And so we have a lot, including in the Bitterroot and in Idaho. And typically, when we see sort of low severity fires, small and patchy, we're not seeing huge impacts on stream temperatures because we're not losing a lot of that canopy. We're not losing a lot of shading. And so often aquatic ecologists really immediately focus in these areas that look more impacted, that have had experienced some sort of fire severity. And so both in the Bitterroot as well as in Idaho, some work by Jason Dunham, you know, we found that in areas that had high severity burn, that had more than just really small patches, you can see an increase of 1.5 to 2.2 increases in summer maximum temperatures. You lose shade, you're going to increase temperature. I know this is like earth-shattering to you guys. And then the other thing that was part of the paper out of Idaho was what a large effect that debris flows and channel reorganization can have. And so when you have these severe fires that go through and kind of reorganize, reshift that channel, and that is often associated with these large debris flows, you can get increases in summertime maximum temperatures up to 4 degrees C. And in Idaho, in the Boise River Basin, they found if even across, you know, different elevation gradients, you're really exceeding 20 degrees C, which is very hot for our cold water fauna in these burned and reorganized streams regularly, even at some of their higher elevation sites. And so certainly, you know, you can get these large changes in temperature typically associated with those big events. But those events are like, that's a site-specific thing, right? And so one of the things we wanted to look at is, as you guys know, there's more of a fire mosaic burned, and this is some work throughout the Bitterroot here that we, again, did with Chris Clancy, Leslie Nice from Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and Mike Jacober. And we just looked, based on temperature loggers they've had, not only how much of an increase are we seeing in those high severity sites, but are we seeing that persist throughout the tributary? Or are we seeing, you know, temperatures cool down? And so when we were looking at sort of maximum summertime temperatures, there was no effect once we got beyond 1.5 kilometers kind of below the burn. That's not an exact number. You're kind of stuck with where that logger was and where that fire burned, right? So that was below the edge of the high severity boundary based on the fire maps. And so one of the things that certainly we've seen in a lot of the Bitterroot streams is that when you have these high severity burns, you see these thermal refuges persist in these mixed severity fires. That hot water is going to cool as it moves downstream, as you get groundwater inflow and as you move into more shaded areas. And so you get this patchwork of water temperatures. But where we do see high severity burns and the loss of that riparian canopy cover here. One of these is Laird Creek, which you'll see a lot for those of you in this area. It was a fairly extreme burn. But this is from our maximum temperatures, burned versus unburned sites. That this increase in those maximum summertime temperatures across the summer months from June, July, and August, those were maintained for 7 to 10 years. And in Idaho, they were seeing the same thing in that Boise River Basin study. These, they're going to recover when the vegetation, when that shade returns, right? So certainly when we see these changes, they are persistent changes and long-term changes. And so a lot of people are curious about what effect that has on aquatic biota, and you'll see different results from different studies. That's because they're in different areas, right? There's different contexts. So this is just a really, because, whether it's climate change or fire, everyone's like, it's good, it's bad. I'm like, well, it depends on where you are, right? And so when we think about physiological processes, whether this is some sort of aerobic performance curve, most ectotherms, including fish, have a hump-shaped kind of performance curve. And so if you're in a low elevation site where fish are already sort of near their optimum or above their optimum, and you're moving into those areas that are just too hot for survival or for maximum performance, you're going to see habitat degradation and effects on fish. Whereas some of the higher elevation cold water systems, where they're sort of on the lower end of their scope for growth, you're going to actually see higher growth rates in these areas because they're going to be moving towards their thermal optimum, right? So often you'll see differences depending on whether these sites are low elevation sites and summertime temperatures are already at their sort of maximums or beyond their optimal temperature versus these higher elevation sites. Okay. So the other thing that people have looked a lot about is water chemistry and sediment input. And certainly, again, we're thinking about not just water chemistry, but for those of you who have worked on these landscapes, you see and know that often there is a lot of sediment input associated with those high severity burns. You get a lot of turbidity and you get a lot of input of fine sediment as well as gravels. Okay. And so there has been quite a bit of work on this, and I am going to just touch on a few points that would probably be more appropriate for wilderness, less so around some of the urban areas. But we know that wildfires release these minerals from the soil, and so we do see an increase in nitrogen and phosphorus associated with sort of post-fire streams. And so we're seeing nutrients and the potential for higher productivity in these streams. And people have looked at this and found that depending on burn severity, pre-fire organic matter, and where vegetation has yet to recover, you can see increases in nitrogen and phosphorus for at least 5 years. But again, just like, as I'm sure the fire world has learned, and like they call them SZM, stream management zones or something, right? That these riparian areas, once they recover, they're going to capture a lot of that nitrogen and phosphorus before it hits the stream. And one of the things I will highlight is when you're looking, especially in the cold water areas, like in the Frank Church, they have seen an increase in primary production resulting from both nutrients and sunlight in those streams. Okay. When we think about what's happening with the sediment, that is an issue that is, I would argue that we're seeing a lot more variation on the landscape. There's two things that are really variable in streams and hard to find significant effects, especially when you use spatial comparisons. One is sediment, the other is wood. Okay, I'm just gonna say there's so much variation on the landscape. And so we know that severe burns, we're gonna get more sediment and more debris flows into these streams. Again. But this is work from David Pilliod, who's now at USGS. And we know that we see a lot of that sediment decrease. So the source of sediment decreases as plants reestablish, that sediment loading decreases. and you get sediment sorting. So high flows will bring that fine sediment downstream, right? So we often, if we have plants reestablishing fairly quickly, we will see gravels and cobbles not be so embedded, and potentially a return within, depending on the system, anywhere between 5 years to a decade often, if you get that regrowth. Okay. One thing that Sean briefly mentioned, and this is something that people, Charlie Luce, I don't know how to say it, he's out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, is they have seen with the debris flows a lot of gravels coming into those streams. And so one thing that people are interested in, and they recently demonstrated, is we do see spawning areas shifting around for fish that use gravels, for reds, associated with that input of gravel. So any debris flow, will do this, but certainly debris flows post-fire will. And so they are definitely can be good seeds for bringing gravels and spawning gravels into streams. Okay. When there's been a fair amount of work in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. Sorry, I've always just called it the Frank Church. And work out of Pocatello, Idaho, by Gary Minshaw and now Colton Baxter, two aquatic ecologists there. They've tracked, in particular, I think the Diamond Peak fire over time there. And so Minshaw had students working on what's happened across multiple streams with water chemistry, substrate, and then macroinvertebrates or aquatic insects. And certainly they were seeing impacts, but after the fire, there was a drought. And so what was happening is they weren't able to see very strong responses because the variation in annual flows across the years post-wildfire had a bigger impact or as much of an impact on streams as a wildfire in terms of the benthic, in terms of the substrate and benthic community. So there's a lot of spatial variation, there's a lot of temporal variation, and certainly for these fires that may burn in mosaics, it's hard to see something unless you have a huge basin that's completely burned with high severity. Like Laird Creek was a big fire. But certainly in the wilderness, in terms of the way it burns, as you guys have just seen, it may be hard to pull those apart from just natural variation. And then certainly you guys have worked in the field, and if you've sampled, you experience this yourselves. But just like on the landscape, we see an increase in large woody debris over decades, not necessarily right away, but certainly the sites that are looking at how fish habitat has changed over 10 years at least, almost all of them demonstrate or see increases in large wood. This large wood is useful for creating habitat complexity. It's holding back spawning gravels. It can be really useful for streams. Okay. So I want to say a few words about sort of what all those changes in habitat mean for these stream food webs. So when I'm thinking about stream food webs, I'm going to focus more on, we often see an increase in primary production. And so what does that mean for stream invertebrates and fish? We definitely have seen changes associated with emergence. Colton Baxter did some work on that, I'll briefly mention, as well as other riparian predators. Okay. And I will highlight that a lot of the work that we have done, at least in the Bitterroot, on stream food webs and fish, have really been in these areas where we've had sort of severe fire sites. Again, partially because we're not seeing a lot of effect on streams in these low sites. And these are where we've seen the short-term or acute effects on fish or invertebrates. And so we wanted to look at that recovery, right? Okay. And so if you kind of summarize the literature, which is for the areas around sort of Montana and Idaho. We see a lot of variation in responses from aquatic communities, in particular invertebrates. And given the variation in streams in terms of how cold they are, what the substrate's like, that may not surprise you that there's a lot of variation. And as I mentioned, the work out of Frank Church, out of Minshall's lab with his student, they found that initial condition and those post-fire conditions independent of fire really moderated the effects of the wildfire. And so it was hard to get at significant effects in terms of the aquatic community beyond that there was more production. Okay. But exactly how that aquatic community changed was really variable between streams as they looked 5 years post-fire. We've also seen across different Idaho studies in particular, they've kind of looked at the recovery Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, because this includes some of the Yellowstone work. The recovery of aquatic insect communities were not only influenced by kind of those initial fire characteristics and vegetation recovery, but also what happened post-fire. And so for those of you on the landscape, I know you will know if you get a lot of rain post-fire and you get a lot of flooding, you're going to get a lot more debris flow, a lot more substrate movement, right? You're going to get a lot more turbidity and erosion. And so certainly thinking about what those conditions are post-fire really influence the recovery of the aquatic community. And in streams that they've seen, channel reorganization and large-scale impacts, that community is probably going to end up somewhere different than it was before, just in terms of the species composition, right? Just because of the conditions have changed so much. It doesn't mean that they're not good fish food or frog food or bat food. Just, it's just certainly going to be a bigger impact. But if we look overall, and don't try to look at sort of the edges, right? But look at what's happening in sort of the average study that people have looked at aquatic insect communities. I would say that we often see a shift of species with faster life histories. So these are shorter-lived aquatic insects that have multiple reproductive events per summer, so they're more productive, and species that can burrow or move and get away from some of those post-flood events. And so those species tend to be more productive in general. So if you look at fires, we often see more primary production and more aquatic insect production, just in terms of biomass. Okay. And so this is some work out of the Frank Church, again, following up on the Diamond Peak fire out of Colden Baxter's lab. This is Rachel Nellison's work, which again is out of Pocatello. And they classified unburned, low, and high. And certainly they're seeing sort of lots of variation in chlorophyll, which is an indicator of primary production. In general, benthic insects were highest 5 years post-fire in the high fire class, high severity sites. That resulted in more of those aquatic insects like stoneflies and caddisflies and mayflies, those insects that actually have a terrestrial adult life stage. So they came out of the stream. And then they saw sort of more bats utilizing those streams and the streams around high fire for foraging. So we do see impacts out of this production, even though we're seeing a lot of variation in exactly what community shift. Ooh. Okay, so what about fish? We know in the Bitterroot that even though there were a lot of fish streams burned, we saw fish kills in 7 streams, but that's a small portion of how much area burned in general. And so if you look across sites that were sampled pre in 1991 versus post-fire, 2001, the first year, and this is percent of the basin burned, moderate to high severity, we're not seeing significant effects associated with the bull trout. And then post-fire, Not very many significant effects, but in general, you'll see more of these dots are above the line than below, and so there's a small increase, regardless of whether there is a debris flow. And they saw essentially the same thing with cutthroat. So this is sort of just looking at what's happened right after is just fish were fairly resilient to those changes in the Bitterroot from the 2000 fires. And you can go through and think about, well, what are the decadal effects of those fires? So we've looked at multiple burned and unburned streams. And some of the impacts are, we have seen some of the riparian shading come back, so there hasn't been huge summer temperature effects. Too much maintained, burn is on top. A lot more large wood. The stream embeddedness was about the same, but less high canopy cover. And in those areas, we're also seeing similar to what's been seen in Idaho, where we see more aquatic insects coming out of those streams and drifting down as fish food. And so this may not surprise you. This is just a longer look at changes in fish density. And this is the response of cutthroat trout. And so right after, in some of the sites that we were able to track long term, we saw an initial decrease in the sites in these food web sites, but then an increase as we in the burn sites over the unburned sites in terms of changes in density compared to that 91 baseline that we used. Bull trout are trickier. They're a lot patchier and other things are affecting bull trout, so we saw no impact of bull trout. One of the things we did want to look at is what else was happening with other species, and whether this was really influenced similar across the full Bitterroot Basin. So we just looked at presence absence between 91 and sort of the early 2010s across 280 sites across the Bitterroot. And we looked at sort of how fish occupancy changed. Were they gone? Did they come to that site based on temperature, barriers, fire severity, and then drainage area, slope, vegetation cover, and road density? And, sorry. This is just the take home. Cold water fish, regardless of fire, are generally losing ground at these lower elevation, warmer sites, both bull trout and sculpin. Sculpin are extirpated, and they were the only one in our data set of all the species that were had extirpation rates associated with fire severity. And barriers can influence colonization or return of species for both cutthroat and sculpin. And so just so you know, you might know what sculpin are. They're a cold water fish like bull trout. They tend to be resident, so they don't move around a lot. They're benthic and they don't have a swim bladder and they're kind of weak swimming. And so they're a species that most people that aren't in most fish studies, they're a non-game fish, but they're prey for a lot of predators. And they are the only ones that we saw associated with warmer streams, but also wildfire disturbance. Okay. And so when we think about fish populations, how are they going to respond to fire? They're going to respond to fire based on how much fragmentation is in that basin, the fish life history, and movement capacity. A lot of our native trout and salmonids have adults outside of those tributaries, so it can come back and reestablish relatively quickly. And then, of course, the fire characteristics and recovery. I'm like this. This is similar to what David Pilley had seen in Idaho. He looked at effects of bull trout and tail frogs on a whole variety of variables, and there was no association of time since wildfire or severity on the occupancy, but they did see decreases with hotter temperatures overall, decreases with winter high flow events, and less canopy cover. Okay, this is my summary. And so when we think about effects of fire on stream fish populations in these areas. Certainly in areas that are low elevation, that are already warm, that are fragmented, certainly there are going to be areas that there are going to be negative effects, right? And some of these, because there's less natural resilience in the system. But in areas that are high elevation and connected, we see very few effects. And often that's where wilderness is, right? They're in these higher elevation areas, they're burning with these mixed severities. And so we see a lot of resiliency in the system. And in many cases, we see benefits of fire in terms of higher production and gravels. There are some unknowns, both. I think that what happens after fire in terms of flood and flowing, and especially winter floods in the long term, like with climate change, are a big unknown in terms of what we're going to see long term in terms of fish and fire. And so those are my quick review of fire effects. And one more. Thanks to everyone. And there are some good reviews and work associated with both wilderness. Okay, I tried to go. Sorry. Oh, and one plug. Kelly Kareem is the aquatic ecologist at the Ada Leopold Wilderness Institute, and we're currently collaborating on a pyrodiversity and aquatic biota study of the Bob with Leah. So there hopefully will be even more aquatic wilderness fire work.